When I first began to wrestle with the concept of white rage, wasn't Ferguson. It was, in fact, in February 1999, when a black man in New York City stepped out on his doorstep after a long, hard day's work to go get something to eat, and he was greeted with 41 bullets, 19 of which hit him. His name was Amadou Diallo, and he was gunned down by the NYPD. Amadou Diallo was unarmed. That was bad enough. But as we know from these killings, it is the response that begins to tell you what is happening in society. And so I'm sitting there and I'm listening to Mayor Rudy Giuliani in an interview with Ted Koppel on Nightline. And Ted Koppel is talking about the NYPD, the Amadou Diallo killing. He's talking about 41 bullets. He's talking about stop and frisk. He's talking about police brutality. And Rudy Giuliani says, I have the most restrained and best behaved police force you can imagine. Okay, yeah, I had one of those Scooby-Doo moments. and then he began to talk about how his policies were working. That what he has put in place in New York City has brought down crime. New York City is a safer place because of his policies. And he has, flow charts and graphs and bars, everything. And what you don't hear is that an unarmed black man stepped out on his porch and was gunned down. I'm sitting there going, something is fundamentally wrong. Structurally wrong. I didn't know what to call it. I didn't know what to label it, but I knew something was going on. And I, continue as a professor, began working and thinking and working and thinking. And then August 2014, the television is on and I'm watching, and I see Ferguson in flames. And then I hear the pundits talking. And what they were talking about was black rage. Why are black people burning up where they live? What is wrong with black people? How could they burn up where they live? Well, there's something wrong with black people. And why are they burning up where? And it didn't matter what ideological stripe. It was all centered, the baseline, the starting point was black rage. And I found myself in this moment shaking my head. You know that moment when you're shaking your head, something's going on, and you don't even realize, you're going, that's not right. That's not right. And that's when it hit me. I said, no, what we're really seeing is white rage. What we're really seeing is that we have been so focused in on the flames, we have missed the kindling. We have missed what has stoked this fire. We have missed, for instance, the disfranchisement of the black community in Ferguson that had, through all kinds of shenanigans and rigmarole, had created where in the 2013 municipal election, in a population that is 67% of Ferguson's population, you had a 6% black voter turnout. You got to work really hard to make that happen. We missed in Ferguson schools that had been on probation for 15 years. 15 years, where a state has an accounting system of a basically accreditation of 140 points, and Ferguson public schools were getting 10 points a year. And we have allowed that to happen for 15 years. We have allowed an entire generation of students to go through from kindergarten to graduation with a school in a school system that we know doesn't work. Kindling. We have a police force that didn't see that its role was to protect and serve, but saw African Americans as a revenue generating source that could provide 25% of the city's budget. Kindling. And what all of this kindling does, and as I started wrestling with white rage, I began to understand that what we're really looking at are the policies. As a nation, we are so drawn to the spectacular. We are so drawn to what we can see that we miss those tectonic plates that are actually moving. White rage moves subtly, almost imperceptibly, corrosively, through the courts, legislatures, government bureaucracies, through the White House, through Congress, and it wreaks havoc subtly, imperceptibly, so that it's hard to discern what is the source of what you're seeing. And so I set out to make white rage visible. Because the first thing you got to do is you got to be able to see this thing. The trigger for white rage is black advancement. It is not the mere presence of black people that is the catalyst for white rage, but it is blackness with ambition, blackness with drive, with purpose, with aspirations, with demands for full and equal citizenship. It is blackness that refuses to accept subjugation, blackness that refuses to give up. And through a formidable array of policy assaults and legal maneuvering, white rage consistently punishes black resilience and black resolve. How else can we reasonably explain why government after government fought so hard to keep black children from getting an education? We saw it after the Civil War. We saw it all the way through the Brown decision. We see it now. Why is it so difficult to educate black children? Why do we have this even when, at least since 1957 and Sputnik, when the U.S. said, oh, we have a national security crisis, we must educate as many of our citizens as we can to be able to effectively wage the Cold War. But Brown was not going to get implemented. So even in the face of a national security crisis, even in the face when we say this is what our nation needs, white rage says, I don't think so. Or why would this nation design a war on drugs that incarcerates most those who sell and do drugs the least? Why? And why particularly after the triumphs and the successes of the civil rights movement, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965? Why would we incarcerate communities? Why would we overwhelm state budgets? Why would we destabilize families? Why would we do this to those who aren't the primary users and sellers of narcotics? Why? Why would state after state develop ruse after ruse to keep American citizens from being able to vote and to have a say in their own democracy? Why? When we say we value democracy, when we say this is why we fight, then why would we have such mass voter suppression? And understand that none of this was done with a mere Klan cross, right? There weren't any cross burnings that just made all of this happen. All of this was done coolly, methodically, systematically. And so in my new book, White Rage, I trace this historical pattern with signpost, Reconstruction, the Great Migration, the Brown decision, the Civil Rights Movement, and the election of Barack Obama. And I also trace it through three key sectors: education, the criminal justice system, and the right to vote. And so now I want to read some excerpts. So as you know, in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was unconstitutional, overturned the Plessy decision, and said that we must integrate. Jim Crow was no longer the law of the land. The South rose up and said, with massive resistance, and said, and used a series of ruses that, in fact, dragged this process out for a long, long time. Well, in 1973, the court battles are still going on. In 1973, there was an area in San Antonio called the Edgewood District. And in the Edgewood neighborhood, it was 96% Mexican American and African American. It was the poorest neighborhood in San Antonio, with the lowest median income and the lowest property values. They taxed themselves at the highest rate in order to try to fund their children's education. By taxing themselves at the highest rate, they garnered $21 per capita. Meanwhile, Alamo Heights, which was a predominantly white neighborhood in San Antonio, taxed themselves at a much lower rate. They garnered over $300 per student. Lower rate, 1,500% more in funding. Now, what we know is that property values have a lot to do with public policy. Where governments choose, say, to put the landfill, where they choose to put the highway, where they choose to zone certain types of businesses and not others, has a lot to do with property value. So the parents in the Edgewood district took Texas to court and said, this violates our children's 14th Amendment rights to have equal protection under the law. It violates Brown. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 decision. 4 of the justices were appointed by Richard Nixon, and 1 was appointed by Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower. That, quote, there is no fundamental right to education in the Constitution. They said that the state's funding scheme did not systematically discriminate against all poor people in Texas, and that because districts across the United States used property taxes, that this method was not so irrational as to be invidiously discriminatory. Thurgood Marshall, his dissent, and that's what I'm going to read. Fully recognizing the implications of Rodriguez, the name of the case, Justice Thurgood Marshall was apoplectic. More than 40% of black children, 14 and under, lived with families below the poverty line, as compared with about 10% of white children. Under those circumstances, Marshall feared, African American children wouldn't stand a chance. The decision, he wrote in his dissent, could only be seen as a retreat from a commitment to equality of educational opportunity, as well as an unsupportable capitulation to a system which deprives children of the chance to reach their full potential as citizens. He was simply dumbfounded that the majority would acknowledge the existence of widely disparate funding for schools across Texas, but then, instead of focusing on the cause of that disparity, clumsily pirouette to all of the state's supposed efforts to close the gaps. The issue, Marshall explained, is not whether Texas is doing its best to ameliorate the worst features of a discriminatory scheme, but rather whether the scheme itself is in fact unconstitutionally discriminatory. Moreover, he found it the height of absurdity that Texas could actually argue that there was no correlation between funding and school quality. You can't make this up. And then, from that faulty premise, deduce that there were no discriminatory consequences for the children of the disadvantaged districts. He was equally unimpressed with Texas's tendency to parade before the justice the stories of children who had excelled despite living in under-resourced districts as some sort of proof that funding was irrelevant, that a child could excel even when forced to attend an underfunded school with poor physical facilities, less experienced teachers, larger classes, and a number of other deficits compared to a school with substantially more funds, Marshall barked, is to the credit of the child, not the state. But Rodriguez placed the onus solely on the backs of the most vulnerable, while walling off access to the necessary resources for quality education, and played beautifully into the colorblind post-civil rights language of substituting economics for race, yet achieving a similar result. The simple truth was that, by virtue of the sheer demographics of poverty, Rodriguez would have not only a disparate impact on African American children, but also a disastrous one. I know, sobering. And I then move into the war on drugs, because it has so warped American society in ways that are so profound. And so I walk us through how the war on drugs emerged. I then walk us through the court cases, the Supreme Court decisions that Michelle Alexander in the New Jim Crow so beautifully laid out. And then I begin to lay out some of those consequences. And so as I go through the court cases, I then say, taken together, those rulings allowed, indeed encouraged, the criminal justice system to run racially amok. And that's exactly what happened on July 23rd, 1999 in Tulia, Texas. In the dead of night, local police launched a massive raid and busted a major cocaine trafficking ring. At least that's how it was billed by the local media, which, after being tipped off, lined up to get the best, most humiliating photographs of 46 of the town's 5,000 residents, handcuffed, in pajamas, underwear, and uncombed bed hair, paraded into the jail for booking. The local newspaper, the Tulia Sentinel, ran the headline, "Tulia streets cleared of garbage." The editorial praised law enforcement for ridding Tulia of drug-dealing scumbags. The raid was the result of an 18-month investigation by a man who would be named by Texas's Attorney General as Outstanding Lawman of the Year. Attached to the federally funded Panhandle Regional Narcotics Task Force, based in Amarillo, about 50 miles away from Tulia, Tom Coleman didn't lead a team of investigators. Instead, he single-handedly identified each member of this massive cocaine operation and made more than 100 undercover drug purchases. He was hailed as a hero, and his testimony immediately led to 38 of the 46 being convicted, with the other cases just waiting to get into the clogged court system. Joe Moore, a pig farmer, was sentenced to 99 years for selling $200 worth of cocaine to the undercover narcotics agent. Kizzy White received 25 years, while her husband, William Cash Love, landed 434 years for possessing an ounce of cocaine. Well, the case began to unravel, however, when Kizzy's sister, Tanya, went to trial. Coleman swore that she had sold him drugs. Tanya, however, had video proof that she was at a bank in Oklahoma City, 300 miles away, cashing a check at the very moment he claimed to have bought cocaine from her. Then another defendant, Billy Don Wafer, had timesheets and his boss's eyewitness testimony that Wafer was at work and not out selling drugs to Coleman. And when the outstanding lawman of the year swore under oath that he had purchased cocaine from Ewell Bryant, a tall, bushy-haired man, only to have Bryant, bald and 5'6", appear in court, it finally became very clear that something was awry. Coleman, in fact, had no proof whatsoever that any of the alleged drug deals had taken place. There were no audio tapes, no photographs, no witnesses, no other police officers present, no fingerprints but his on the bags of drugs, no records. Over the span of an 18-month investigation, he never wore a wire. Now, he claimed to have written each drug transaction on his leg, but to have washed away the evidence when he showered. So I'm either thinking he showered once in 18 months. Okay. Additional investigation led to no corroborating proof. When the police arrested those 46 people and vigorously searched their homes and possessions, no drugs were found, nor were weapons, money, paraphernalia, or any other indication at all that the housewife, pig farmer, or anyone else arrested were actually drug kingpins. What was discovered, however, was judicial misconduct running rampant in the war on drugs in Tulia, Texas, with a clear racial bias. Coleman had accused 10% of Tulia's black population of dealing in cocaine. Based on his word alone, 50% of all of the black men in the town were indicted, convicted, and sentenced to prison. Randy Credico of the William Moses Kunstler Fund for Racial Justice called Tulia a mass lynching. Taking down 50% of the male black adult population like that? It's outrageous. It's like being accused of raping someone in Indiana in the 1930s. You didn't do it, but it doesn't matter, because a bunch of Klansmen on the jury are going to string you up anyway. But this wasn't 1930. It was the beginning of the 21st century, and a powerful civil rights movement had bridged those two eras. And then the last excerpt I want to read. The last chapter deals with the election of President Obama and how white rage reared up in really deep, profound ways, almost in ways that we hadn't seen in years. And so as I walk through voter suppression, and then I move into the threats on his life and the disrespect that the office of the president received, I then begin to deal with the violence. Black respectability or appropriate behavior doesn't seem to matter. If anything, Black achievement, Black aspiration, and Black success are construed as direct threats. Obama's presidency made that clear. Aspirations and their achievement provide no protection, not even to the God-fearing. On June 17th, 2015, South Carolinian Dylan Roof, a white, unemployed 21-year-old high school dropout, was on a mission to take his country back. Ever since George Zimmerman had walked out of the courthouse a free man after killing Trayvon Martin, and a racially polarized nation debated the verdict, Roof had looked to understand the history of America. Trolling through the internet, he stumbled across the Council of Conservative Citizens, Tri-C, the progeny of the 1950s White Citizens Council that had terrorized Black people, closed schools, and worked hand in hand with state governments to defy federal civil rights laws. But despite the group's avowed racist belief system, in the mid to late 1990s, as the Southern Poverty Law Center reports, the group boasted of having 34 members who were in the Mississippi legislature and had powerful Republican Party allies, including then Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott of Mississippi. By 2004, Mississippi Governor Haley Barbour, the chair of the Republican National Committee, and 37 other powerful politicians had all attended Tri-C events in the 21st century. Earl Holt, the chair of the Tri-C, gave $65,000 to Republican campaign funds in recent years, including donations to the 2016 presidential campaigns of Rand Paul, Rick Santorum, and Ted Cruz. The Tri-C then enjoyed precisely the cachet of respectability that racism requires to achieve its own goals within American society. And its website of hatred and lies provided the self-serving education Dylan Roof so desperately craved. He drank in the poison of its message, got into his car, drove to Charleston, entered Emmanuel AME Church, and landed in a Bible study with a group of African Americans who were the very model of respectability. Roof prayed with them, read the Bible with them, thought they were so nice. Then he shot them dead, leaving just one woman alive so that she could tell the world what he had done and why. "You're taking over our country," he said, and he knew this to be true. Well, not even a full month after Dylan Roof gunned down 9 African Americans at Emmanuel AME in Charleston, South Carolina, Republican presidential frontrunner Donald Trump fired up his silent majority audience of thousands in July 2015 with a macabre promise. "Don't worry, we'll take our country back." No, it's time instead that we take our country forward into the future. Thank you. Thank you.